Some events in life are so unexpected that they leave an imprint you can never remove. That's how it was the day Zayn walked into my room without warning. It was a typical afternoon. Adil, my husband, was at the office as usual, and Zayn, his son from a previous marriage, had recently moved back after a difficult breakup. Since his return, we had been walking on eggshells around each other, avoiding any old tensions. I was in my room trying on a dress for an upcoming event when I decided to change into something else. It was during this change, standing in my underwear, that the door opened. Make sure to subscribe to my channel, so I can continue bringing you more fascinating true stories like this one. And don't forget to watch this video till the end, and like the video because this story is going to be incredibly interesting. Please hit the like button to show your support. Maya, have you seen Zayn? Adil's voice cut off. Zayn froze in the doorway, his eyes widening. I gasped and quickly grabbed something to cover myself. Zayn, I called out, but he hurriedly turned away, almost tripping. The door slammed shut, leaving me standing there, my face red with embarrassment and confusion. Zayn's return had unsettled me. Adil had suggested it without discussing it with me first, and while it didn't surprise me, Adil often made decisions without thinking of the consequences. It still felt off. Zayn needs a place to stay for a while, Adil had said one evening, barely looking up from his phone. You don't mind, do you? Naturally, I couldn't refuse. Zayn had always been polite, though somewhat distant, and we had maintained a cordial, though superficial relationship, but having him here was different. His presence served as a constant reminder of Adil's past, and it made the atmosphere tense. At 25, Zayn was attractive in a way that was impossible to ignore. He shared Adil's dark hair and sharp jawline, but his eyes were softer and more thoughtful. He carried himself with a quiet confidence that made his recent heartbreak all the more surprising. He cheated on me, Zayn had confessed one night at dinner when Adil wasn't home. I had tried to keep the conversation light, but Zayn's bluntness caught me off guard. I'm so sorry, Zayn, I had said. Don't be, he had shrugged. It happens. One Wednesday afternoon, when Adil was at the office and Zayn was supposed to be out running errands, I was in my room trying on a dress for an upcoming charity event. The dress didn't fit as I remembered, so with a sigh I took it off and tossed it on the bed. Standing there, in just my bra and underwear, I was looking for something else when the door opened. Maya, have you seen Zayn? His voice cut off as his eyes took in the scene. I froze, my hand still holding the hanger as his gaze shifted between me and the floor. His face turned bright red, and he quickly spun around, almost knocking over a lamp. I'm sorry, he stammered, backing out of the room. Zayn, I gasped, quickly grabbing a robe. The door slammed shut, and I stood there, my heart racing, as the reality of what had just happened sank in. For the rest of the day I avoided him. I stayed in my room pretending to be busy, but I couldn't focus on anything. The image of his shocked face haunted me, and each time I thought about it, a flush of embarrassment spread through me. At dinner that evening, the tension between us was thick. Did you finish those errands today? I asked, trying to act casual. Yeah, Zayn replied, not looking up from his plate. Adil glanced between us, oblivious to the awkwardness. I told Zayn he should take some time off and figure things out. That's a good idea, I said, though my voice was too bright. Zayn looked up, his face unreadable. I appreciate your hospitality, he said. I won't stay longer than I need to. Don't be silly, Adil said, dismissing the idea. Your family. The days that followed were unbearable. Every interaction with Zayn felt loaded, as though we were both trying not to cross an invisible line. He avoided being alone with me, and I convinced myself it was for the best. But despite my efforts to push the incident from my mind, I found myself thinking about it more often than I liked. One evening I caught him looking at me from across the room. His gaze was brief, but it lingered long enough to make my stomach flutter. I quickly looked away, pretending not to notice, but the moment stayed with me. It wasn't long before I began noticing changes in his behavior. He started coming home earlier, spending more time in shared spaces. One night, I found him in the kitchen, leaning against the counter with a glass of water in his hand. Can't sleep, I asked, keeping my tone light. He shrugged. Something like that. We stood in silence for a moment, the hum of the refrigerator the only sound. About the other day, he said quietly, I'm sorry. You don't have to apologize, I said quickly. I shouldn't have just walked in, he continued, his gaze fixed on the floor. It was an accident, I said softly. Let's just forget about it. He looked up, his eyes meeting mine. Is that what you want? The question caught me off guard. I didn't know how to respond. It's for the best, I finally said. He nodded, though his expression suggested he wasn't fully convinced. Things came to a head one evening when Adil called to say he'd be working late. I was in the living room scrolling through a magazine when Zain came in. He hesitated in the doorway, unsure whether to stay or leave. Want to watch something? He asked finally, gesturing to the TV. Sure, I said, setting the magazine aside. He sat down beside me. We watched in silence, but the air between us crackled with unspoken tension. At one point our hands brushed as we reached for the remote, and I felt an electric jolt. He pulled his hand back quickly, his face turning pink. Sorry, he muttered. It's okay, I replied, though my voice trembled. The moment passed, but it left a lingering sense of possibility, one we both ignored. A few nights later, I was awake well past midnight. The house was quiet except for the faint ticking of the grandfather clock. I got out of bed and went to the kitchen to make tea, only to find Zain already there. He sat at the table, a mug of coffee in his hand, his gaze distant. The soft light from the under-cabinet lamps cast shadows across his face, making him look older than his 25 years. Can't sleep either, I asked, leaning against the doorframe. He looked up, startled, then gave a faint smile. Something like that. I poured myself a cup of tea and sat across from him. For a moment we sat in silence. Then unexpectedly he broke the quiet. Do you ever feel stuck? He asked, his voice low but steady. Stuck, I repeated, tilting my head. Like you're just going through the motions, he said, staring into his coffee. Doing what everyone expects but never really living for yourself. His words hit me harder than I expected. I hesitated before responding. Yes, I said quietly. More often than I'd like to admit. He looked up, his eyes searching mine. What do you do about it? I don't know, I admitted. I've spent so much time putting others first. Adil, this house. Never thinking about what I want. Zain's gaze remained steady. Maybe it's time you did. His words hung in the air between us, a challenge I wasn't sure I was ready for. After that night, things between us shifted. It started small, a lingering glance, a brush of hands in the hallway. One afternoon, I was in the garden pruning roses when Zain joined me. Need help? He asked, crouching beside me. Do you even know how to prune a rosebush? I teased. Not a clue, he admitted with a grin. I laughed, handing him the shears. Well, let's hope you don't kill it. As we worked together, I felt a sense of ease I hadn't experienced in years. Zain's presence was grounding in a way I hadn't expected. You're good at this, I said, watching him carefully trim a branch. Beginner's luck, he grinned. No, really, I said, you have a good eye for detail. He glanced at me, his expression softening. Maybe I learned it from watching you. The compliment caught me off guard, leaving me momentarily speechless. Later that evening, as we cleaned up after dinner, our hands brushed again as we reached for the same plate. The brief contact sent a jolt through me, reminding me of everything that had been building between us. Sorry, Zain muttered, pulling his hand back quickly. It's fine, I said, though my voice trembled. He hesitated before speaking again. Sana, he said, looking up at me. Nothing. Never mind. The tension between us was palpable, and I knew everything was about to change. As the days passed, the changes between Zain and me became more evident. We couldn't hide it any longer. The house, once a sanctuary, now felt like a pressure cooker filled with secrets. Finally, the inevitable happened. One morning, Adil confronted me in the kitchen. His face was pale, and his hands trembled as he held up his phone, displaying proof of what had been going on. I know what's been happening, Adil said, his voice filled with disbelief and anger. How long has this been going on? I couldn't bring myself to meet his gaze. Months, I whispered, tears flowing down my face. Adil's face turned bright red with fury. Months? While I've been working, building this life for us, you've been... His voice broke, and I could see the pain in his eyes, but it was too late. Zain walked in at that moment, his expression hardening as he took in the scene. Adil, this isn't just her fault, he said, his voice calm but firm. Don't defend her, Adil snarled, now directing his anger at Zain. You were supposed to be my son. You betrayed me. I didn't mean for this to happen, Zayn said steadily, but I love her. Adil was incredulous. You think this is love? This is selfishness. The argument escalated quickly, accusations flying as I stood frozen in the middle, helpless. Get out, Adil finally shouted. Both of you get out of my house. Please, Adil, I begged, but he turned his back on me, his expression hard and final. I don't want to hear it. You've made your choice. Zayn and I packed our things in silence. The weight of our actions hung heavily in the air. As I loaded my suitcase into the car, I glanced back at the house. It no longer felt like home. It was just a place I used to live. Are you sure about this? I asked Zayn as we got into the car. He didn't respond immediately, keeping his eyes focused on the road ahead. I don't know, I admitted softly, the uncertainty heavy in my chest. As we drove away, my phone buzzed. It was a message from Laura with a link to a post on social media. The post contained screenshots of the messages between Zayn and me. The fallout was swift and brutal. Friends and family turned their backs on me. Their judgment was harsh and unforgiving. Adil filed for divorce within days, leaving me to pick up the pieces of my shattered life. Zayn tried to be my support, but even he couldn't shield me from the storm. The strain of our decision became evident over time. The cracks in our relationship grew harder to ignore. One evening, as we sat in the small apartment we had rented, Zayn turned to me with a heavy look on his face. This isn't what you wanted, he said softly. I looked at him, tears brimming in my eyes. It's not what you wanted either. Zayn stood up, walking toward the door. He paused and glanced back at me. I'll always care about you, he said quietly. But we can't keep doing this. And with that, he was gone. In the months that followed, I tried to rebuild my life. The whispers and judgment from everyone around me were constant reminders of my mistakes. But in the quiet moments, I found a sense of clarity. For the first time in years, I began to think about what I truly wanted. Not for Adil, not for Zayn, but for myself. Looking back, I realized that while I couldn't change the past, I could learn from it. And maybe, just maybe, I could find a way to move forward. The weeks after Zayn left were the hardest of my life. The apartment felt unbearably quiet without him, and the weight of everything I had lost pressed down on me relentlessly. Adil's absence, though expected, left a hollow ache. Friends I thought I could rely on disappeared, their judgment too heavy to hide behind polite conversation. But I couldn't afford to wallow. The first steps of rebuilding were painful but necessary. I took a job at a local art supply store, spending my days surrounded by bright pigments and blank canvases, symbols of potential, though I rarely touched them. It was Maya who reached out first. One morning she called me and asked to meet for coffee. When she arrived, her tone was gentler than before, but her eyes still held caution. I'm not here to lecture you, she said softly, but I just want to know, are you okay? I hesitated, unsure of how to respond. I don't know, I admitted, but I'm trying to be. Maya nodded, her expression thoughtful. That's all you can do. Months later, just as the wounds were starting to scab over, a knock on my door disrupted the fragile peace I had found. I opened it and froze. There, standing in front of me, was Adil. He looked older than I remembered, his face tired, but his presence still carried the same weight. The tension between us was thick as he stood there, searching my face for signs of change. Can we talk? Adil asked, his tone surprisingly calm. I stepped aside to let him in, though the atmosphere was heavy with unspoken words. He didn't sit, instead standing by the window, staring out at the street below. I thought I'd hate you, he began, his voice quiet, for what you did, for what you destroyed. I sat down on the couch, my hands twisted nervously in my lap. Adil, let me finish, he interrupted, turning to face me. I thought I'd hate you, but all I feel is sadness. For us. For what we could have been. His words hit harder than anything else could have. I hadn't meant to hurt him, but I did. I didn't mean to hurt you, I said, my voice trembling. I know, he replied, his voice still filled with sorrow, but that doesn't make it easier. We spent hours talking, revisiting moments from our marriage that we had missed at the time, but now seemed monumental. By the time he left, the anger between us had lessened, replaced by a quiet understanding. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was something I could hold on to. Zayn's departure left an emptiness I couldn't explain. Where had he gone? Did he regret it? Did he still think of me the way I thought of him? One evening as I closed up at the art supply store, I found a letter tucked beneath my windshield wiper. My heart leapt when I recognized the handwriting. Sana, the letter began. I thought leaving would make things easier, but it hasn't. I still think about you. About us. I wonder if you've moved on. I hope you have. Take care of yourself. Zane. The letter wasn't signed, but it didn't need to be. I read it over and over, each word stirring a mix of emotions. Relief, sadness, and a small selfish hope that I hadn't been forgotten. Inspired by the letter, I started painting again. At first, it was just a way to fill the silence, a distraction from the noise in my head. But as the canvases filled with color, I felt a part of myself return. A part one hadn't even realized was missing until then. Maya stopped by one day, noticing the sudden burst of creativity. "These are incredible," she said, gazing at the paintings on the walls. "You should show these." "I don't know," I hesitated. "Don't doubt yourself, Sana," Maya said with insistence. "You have something worth sharing." A year after Zane left, fate brought him back into my life. I was at a gallery opening, my own gallery opening, when I saw him across the room. He looked different, older, but the pull he had was still there. "Sana," he said softly as he approached. "Zane," I replied, my heart racing. We stood there for a moment, the noise of the room fading into the background. "You did it," he said, gesturing to the paintings around us. "I had to," I said, my voice steady for myself. He nodded, a smile playing at the corners of his lips. "I'm proud of you." We talked for hours that night, catching up on everything and nothing. By the time the gallery emptied, the air between us was filled with quiet understanding. Zane didn't stay in town, and his departure this time didn't leave the same ache it once did. It felt like the closing of a chapter one would always treasure, despite the pain it brought. As I stood in my studio surrounded by colors and textures of my new life, I realized that while the past would always be a part of me, it didn't have to define me. For the first time in years, I felt at peace.